Little Richard was an icon ahead of his time. He was the first to wear mascara, the first to strip his shirt off, and the first to play with gender norms. A new documentary looks at the life and legacy of Richard Penniman's emergence from Macon, Georgia in the 1930s through underground black drag clubs and into segregated concert halls. I recently spoke with Emmy Award-winning producer and director Lisa Cortes about the huge impact of Little Richard. Lisa Cortes, it's really good to chat with you. And I first want to say that I thoroughly was fascinated and I enjoyed the documentary about Little Richard. I learned so much. And I just want to begin by asking you, what are your earliest memories of Little Richard in your consciousness?
I think, dancing with my cousins as a kid,
Sure.
doing the twists,
Yeah.
feeling joy.
Mm.
It's someone said it was so infectious.
Yeah.
And it was also, tutti frutti. Like every kid can sing along to that. Obviously, now that we know the origin story of Tutti Frutti, we
Right.
might want to edit. But I think it's just being a kid and the discovery of a music that was so visceral on many levels.
What was that like for you, looking through archival footage and video and discovering gems, etc., deciding who would come on as a talking head?
The first step was that was important for me, was to give Richard agency to tell his story.
Mhm.
Like so often in his life, there is, this cry about recognizing his voice. And so I knew that, yes, this is a cradle to grave story in many ways, but I wanted to find archival that would be Richard, who would be the narrator. And so that was the very first dive that we did. And then there was a dive again to be like, let's find even more obscure performances. Let's find the fans in Finland and Australia who had their own collections. Mm-hmm. So that's the first part of the scaffolding. Then for Richard, it's, people had to have a loving, authentic connection to him. Thus the musicians who had performed with him, the friends and family. But I also knew that Richard was not the most reliable narrator. And so that's why you oftentimes have scholars who are giving you a broader context to explain some of the statements that Richard makes. And I was very intentional with the people that I chose to be part of this great Greek chorus.
And one thing I really want to touch on is his queerness, which he kind of floats in and out of throughout his life, but he is unabashedly queer in the 50s, a real, like, one of the first, I think, who was really just out there and doing his thing. And would you talk about telling that piece of his story?
Well, it's funny that you say he's one of the first, because he's one of the first to become a star.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
So, what I love in this film is to show that whether it's queer artists like Escarita, who play a pivotal part in Richard's career, or this history of drag and performance, which goes back to the 1800s. Like there's this long legacy of queerness that Richard is connected to that is oftentimes not included in the history that we're told. I was very intentional about the scholars that I chose, who are all brilliant African Americans, because I wanted to change who's telling this story. Yeah. And the perspective that they are uniquely able to provide.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it does such an incredible job of doing that. And I wanted to ask you because, there's so much erasure of queer identity and Black history happening right now. And this story is handing a narrative to little Richard that he wasn't afforded in his lifetime. It was kind of stolen from him in a lot of ways because, Elvis was the king of rock and roll, but clearly you make an argument. Little Richard came before. Elvis got some of Little Richard's moves, and then then you get the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Elton John, David Bowie, all the way to Annie Lennox. And you make this really incredible argument that they all grew out of Little Richard in some way. And would you talk a little bit about bringing that history back to him, especially at a time when Black history is being expunged?
Well, we have seen the attacks on Black history. We've seen the attacks on our drag performers and queer history. And what I think is so interesting about this film is, like, for many people, Little Richard was like this one note joke. Shut up, that's his appearances in the 80s particularly. But he is truly a transgressive figure. It's going beyond the music. It is going into culture. It's going into this idea of intersectionality, of everything that is coming together through him that are seemingly disparate elements. This history is real. And, we've been fed oftentimes a whitewash history that has negated the contributions of what is other people call non-normative culture. And so all that Richard brings is what is unique to America. And I think reasserting the influences and the truth is kind of an importance of the story.
I wonder if you would touch on the role of the church and how that influenced Richard in so many ways, including music, and then, of course, kind of grappling with his queerness.
Well, what I love about Richard's story is that he grew up going to two very different kind of churches, one that was more staid, one that was more demonstrative. And I think that is almost a metaphor for Richard, because he kind of pivots between, being quiet, reflective, religious, and then to the other extreme, performative and rock and roll. And it's a pendulum that he swings upon for a great portion of his life. And it is very difficult for him to navigate. And I like how it speaks to the complexity of Richard. He's never one note. And the church is always there, even when he feels distant from it because he's a sinner and rock and roll. You can hear it in his music, and I think you can hear it in his devotion to the art form. I don't think that he ever separates himself, but what is difficult for him is to align rock and roll, which he's taught as the devil's music, with his relationship with God. And that tension makes him beautifully human.
Thank you so much to Lisa Cortes for that conversation. Little Richard, I Am Everything tells the story of the Black queer origins of rock and roll. It premieres in theaters and begins streaming online April 21st. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Tracy E. Gilchrist. Thank you for watching.